Okay, here's your analysis video for Firoozeh Dumas' Funny in Farsi. We're going to look at this as a memoir, which means a book that is written about her personal life, but with a little bit of creativity thrown in here and there. Maybe some of the memories mishmashed together to kind of give more creative effect. And obviously, as we discussed in the early video, lots of humor thrown in. In fact, the title, as we discussed, was an alliterative way of kind of stretching the truth about the language, even Farsi, to get in that descriptor, funny. We talked last time a little bit about the history of Iran and its relationship with the United States. What Dumas' memoir does is give us a sort of personal, family, but yet also very much tied to her own experience as a young girl growing up in America. The subtitle is, in fact, Growing Up Iranian in America. Some of the things that we're going to be looking at, some of the themes that she covers, I've got noted down here. Certainly she's looking at things like stereotypes and prejudice in America. Also cultural shock and cultural translations that need to happen in such things as money, time, beauty, kindness, self-esteem, fear and worry. All of those things have sort of cultural context that we don't typically think about, and which she, through various stories throughout the book, brings to light for us, for us who have grown up as Native Americans, and some of us who have grown up as immigrants. Perhaps we experience those things from different perspectives. She also does some neat things in the writing of these stories. Number one, the humor, but number two, there's also the way in which she sort of switches back and forth in the narrative style, giving the stories from the past, relating every once in a while directly to the reader. Some small moments of sort of breaking that fourth wall and speaking from her older writing voice. There's one scene I'm thinking of in particular when she talks about, when I was writing my book, it was a problem. I couldn't use the maiden name, and her father said, just don't mention our name. And so she said, okay, I'll use my married name. And she seems to be saying this as a tangent, as an aside. And she does things like that throughout the book that kind of portray this mixed tone of a connection between reader and author that says we kind of both know what's going on. And beyond that, it also, if we read into it, it also sort of solidifies her as, hey, I'm American. Even all these things that I've experienced and I've learned have made, a connection with me as an American. Okay. Some other things to consider. I asked you at the end of last time, do we learn anything? And this is part of your discussion that I want you to look at. Despite, well, not despite, but in addition to taking away the humor and the sort of satirical look at what it means to grow up as an immigrant, as an Iranian American, do we learn things about her culture, her history, her father's personal experience, etc., her mother's personal experience? Do we learn those things, or are we just meant to sort of be entertained by them? And my short answer is I believe that she does sprinkle some sort of lessons and educational value throughout. Whether it's specific things where she talks about the revolution of 1979 and the Shah and the Ayatollah, and very specific experiences of discrimination and periods of Iranians in America being detested, like the hostage situation that she mentions. The Iranian Americans were sort of hated and scorned within America, etc. Those are lessons that she's giving us, but then also there are lessons that are implied in terms of how we sort of create our understanding of what it means to be American or America. And you know, she gives us that from very specific Iranian American experience, but one that we can broaden to all sort of immigrants and refugees who have arrived in the United States. And I had you look at that Mary Pfeiffer piece real quick just so you could see who she is and what it is that she wrote about. And she's writing about refugees who, number one, are fleeing, you know, certain traumas around the world and being displaced to certain areas. You know, in her case, she's focusing specifically on America. But within that, there's also the need to sort of reestablish their identities. Who are they in these new places? How do they, you know, make new lives for themselves, and how do they fit in, etc. All of that is part of that sort of ongoing immigrant/refugee identity building. You know, from the very most basic thing, like in Pfeiffer's book, she looks at, you know, pointing people in the right direction and as to how to find the driver's license testing place, or, you know, what items they should keep in a refrigerator, or what a date book is for calendars, and etc. You know, those are sort of small, seemingly inconsequential things, but they really add up to how you function in our sort of established normalcy, right? And it also sort of makes us turn that lens around back on ourselves and points at the sort of arbitrariness of our system, right? Why do these things mean these things? You know, well, we say they do, but, you know, does that mean they have to, etc., and so on. So not only do we get to see, a fish out of water, but we also get to sort of see, well, you know, why is the area that we're dropping that fish into the way it is, you know, and why do we have to sort of impose these particular structures? There are a couple of other things that run under the surface in Dumas' book. You know, one of the things is she looks at gender and sex equality, and by that I mean, you know, women in her culture, etc., but also the way that the men and the woman relate. We looked at this sort of in Cisneros' book. We're seeing something similar here, and there's a scene in one early memoir where she's talking about her mother. I believe it's right in the first few pages, talking about her mother wanting to pursue education, and the teacher was unavailable after some time, and this sort of left her mother's dream just sort of hanging out there. She couldn't pursue her dream to be a midwife, I believe it was. And her father was even somewhat supportive of this, her mother's father, in a way that would be, you know, sort of counter to the traditional belief systems. So a little bit of progressiveness in a culture that would seek to not sort of elevate women on the whole. And Dumas, you can see she ingests some of that idea that the women in her culture can be sort of elevated and brought forward, and American culture might, you know, sort of add to that ability, right? Sort of escaping an oppressive sense of female identity might be a way to sort of stretch those boundaries, as well as depicting the ongoing sort of stretching and pushing and pulling, you know, in her immigrant family, right? She comes from this culture where these things have been taught one way, and she's encountering a culture that says other things, so you've got to sort of balance and create a sort of mixed merger idea of what that means. Couple of other things she talks about in those early chapters: learning to be a cultural broker or a cultural translator. And she mentions that her father had a past here in the United States. He had been in the United States before, and he offered the family many different perspectives on what they were going to encounter and what he learned and what he remembered. And some of that is true, and some of that he's sort of misinterpreted, misapplied, misremembered in ways that, yes, they provide comic effect, but they also show the sort of obstacles that are in the way of adaptations of immigrants and newcomers to this world. And so the young generation, we see early on in pop culture, even the mother does this, is one way of sort of entering into that institutional language that America speaks. And so they learn from TV, and the mother learns from watching the game shows, and the children learn from encountering their friends and what happens at school and all of these things, and they get sort of literal translation jobs, right, speaking the English language as a way to communicate, and they also get the sort of more symbolic translation. What does this mean? And I think about even in that process, the problems there's one example, several examples, but the one that I always remember is the idiom that using elbow grease does not translate. There's the literal sort of what is elbow grease, as a marker of saying, yeah, these things are often very culturally context driven, right? We know what using elbow grease means, but a literal translation of it seems really strange. So that's one way that Dumas chooses to show that cultural exchange, that cultural interplay, is met with obstacles up front and continuously after that. Along with that are the sort of love. Let's simplify it by saying a love-hate relationship with the United States, right? They used one example of Thanksgiving, where the cultures merge. They're very family-centered, and they bring their traditional dishes and put them right alongside the more, mainstream American Thanksgiving fare. And she makes mention that they love their Iranian heritage and history and culture, but they're also very thankful to be in America for lots of reasons. And so there's this continuously organic interplay between the two that they acknowledge throughout. And I think that's really sort of the soul of Dumas' book, is that learning, in this sort of lighthearted way that she does, and her family does, and her sort of microscope on immigrant populations does, is a way that shows that it must continually grow. It's not going to be simply fixed in one position. That interchange must continue over time, and you must be educated, and you must go out, and you must make connections, right? Otherwise, those stereotypes and the discriminatory actions are going to hold court, and they're going to win out in the end. I mentioned earlier, after the revolution, because Dumas and her family came to the United States before the 1979 revolution, but after that revolution, the American people felt a real strong animosity towards Iranians and Iranian Americans in particular. They would look at them kind of a very similar way that eyes after post 9/11 have turned sort of generally scornfully at all Muslims, right, in this sort of blanket judgment of them all. And there's a couple points in the book where she mentions that. And she also mentions that there's a misunderstanding. Americans have a general misunderstanding about Iran and its history and its relationship with Islam in ways that saddens her, and you can hear it in a way where she's stepping down from that humor and kind of sidestepping into some education as well as some sort of personal perspective there that's supposed to, I believe, lay the groundwork for, so-called mainstream Americans to look at themselves. I'm trying to find a page number for an area that I want to show you. Let me see here. I had it earlier and I've since lost it. We'll find it just a second here. Okay, it's actually early. It's page 31. It's the chapter with a little help from my friends, and it begins, I was lucky to have to come to America years before the political upheaval in Iran. The Americans we encountered were kind and curious, unafraid to ask questions, and willing to listen. As soon as I spoke enough English to communicate, I found myself being interviewed non-stop by children and adults alike. My life became one long-running Oprah show, minus the free luxury accommodations in Chicago and Oprah. On the topic of Iran, American minds were tabula rasa. Judging from the questions asked, it was clear that most Americans in 1972 had never heard of Iran. We did our best to educate. You know Asia? Well, you go south of the Soviet Union, and there we are. Or we'd try to be more bucolic, mentioning being south of the beautiful Caspian Sea, where the famous caviar comes from. Most people in Whittier did not know about the famous caviar, and once we explained what it was, they'd scrunch up their faces. Fish eggs, they would say. Gross. We tried mentioning our proximity to Afghanistan or Iraq, but it was no use. Having exhausted our geographical clues, we would say, you've heard of India, Japan, or China? We're on the same continent. And then you skip through all of these, and she goes through several others, sort of explaining, playing the teacher to her friends who were, in their hearts expressing an innocent interest, but really it sort of also implicitly, inquires about her exoticness. And you turn to page 33, at the top, my family and I wondered why Americans had such a mistaken image of Iran. We were offered a clue one day by a neighbor who told us that he knew about Iran because he had seen Lawrence of Arabia. Whoever Lawrence was, we had never heard of him, we said. My father then explained that Iranians are an Indo-European people. We are not Arabs. We do, however, have two things in common with Saudi Arabia. He continued, Islam and petroleum. Now, I won't bore you with religion, he said, but let me tell you about the petroleum industry. Okay, and then skip the next paragraph. I tried my best to be a worthy representative of my homeland, but like a Hollywood celebrity relentlessly pursued by paparazzi, I sometimes got tired of the questions. I, however, never punched anybody with my fists. I use words. And, this goes on. And I choose this section to look at because you can see a very good mix of the lighthearted sort of, let's keep it, surface level, and let me show you what it was like, and almost a stand-up comedian type of, man, isn't this, this crazy, the things I would ask? But it's also very much an effective way to shine a mirror on the way that outsiders and sort of exotic figures are sometimes deeply, though through, it doesn't feel like very harmful intentions, outcast or marginalized or positioned as other, even within, the supposed sort of welcoming American system that we have going. And it sort of balances that for us here in a portrayal like that. And she's teaching there, right? Even the mild sort of, basic geography lesson that she throws in there is educational for many of us, right? For lots of us in a lot of ways. So there are lots of different moments like that in the book that she gets into things. I want to step back for a moment and just sort of retrace our steps with the humor. And I may have said something to this effect in the intro video, but the other thing that introducing humor into a book like this does is that we sort of have to also consider cultural perspectives. You know, Americans and the West in general don't own humor, sarcasm, satire. There's not a sort of monopoly on those things. It's not as if she only became funny after being westernized. You know, we said, oh, well, the reason her Iranian culture now feels funny is because she's learned an American perspective and can look back at it. That's not really the case, and we have to, not to say that we would automatically jump to that, but in some sort of criticisms we might be apt to do that sort of thing. It was only after she learned American ways of thinking that she saw why this was funny. That's not the case at all. We also shouldn't assume that she is covering up any sort of horrors by using humor. It's not sort of laughing so I don't cry, which is kind of a very condescending way of looking at satire and other forms of humor. It suggests that, well, she doesn't want to go into the deep, serious drama of these things, so she pokes fun at them. We shouldn't assume that. I mean, we've talked about the reasons and the outcomes of the humor that she does use as a way to sort of shed light on both her culture and mainstream American culture needing to sort of reflect on their positions within that. So we have to sort of keep that in mind, and that's again part of what I'm asking you in that discussion board question, in that relationship between cultural ethnicity and humor. How do those things sort of interplay with each other? Finally, I want to get to one last thing. As they go through those later stories, and the chapters in the book really kind of function like little episodic stories of happenstance, and the later ones are, bring up issues of beauty, right, and they bring up issues of wealth and other sorts of things that can be sort of culturally deconstructed, right? What does beauty mean in different cultures? What does wealth mean in different cultures? There's the times he talks about, automatically converting everything to Iranian currency in his mind. These sort of things that get us back to the ways that we think. After addressing all of these things, in the early ones where she talks about their home life and their first experiences in America, after, we come to those questions of, why, and in a non-cynical way, we ask ourselves, why write this sort of a book? Why write these things down? Memoirs are always sort of underpinned by that question. Why reveal these things? Why confess these things? Why tell these stories? Right? And we talked about it when we looked at Elie Wiesel's Night, in terms of, to keep silent about these things and to not tell these stories is sort of taking their power away. And we might shy away from doing that with something like humor, something that feels a little bit more light, but we can apply a very similar sort of arc to that idea, right? And we might put a twist on it. We might say, laughing about certain things and not laughing about other things is sort of taking away their sort of weight as well. If we're not able to see the humor or the satire or the absurdity in some of these things, then we're sort of not speaking the complete truth about them all. That's not to say that we go out and we tell jokes about the Holocaust or about this and that, but it does also mean that all subjects, all cultures, all narratives have elements that can be seen in all different sorts of ways, and we can speak them, and we can look at them, and we can sort of narrate them in lots of different ways. And I think that that's, at least part of the question, or part of the answer to that question about why she writes this, why she writes it that way. And by the time we read the end of the book, and we see where she sort of revisited her family and her father, and a little bit she's turned it on herself, we see that there's also growth, right? And there's sort of progressive, not just, yeah, we've gotten better at living in America and we understand more now, but also this sort of, how has the world around us sort of changed as well? And we can look very specifically at their family, and then a little bit bigger at Iranian Americans, and then immigrants as a whole, and then displaced persons, etc. And we begin to see that the world is not just America and American mainstream culture. Sometimes we get sort of encapsulated in that little false sense of the complete world. So that might be, at least, laying inroads down into answering why she approaches this subject in that way. Okay, that's all for now. Hope you enjoyed the book. Be ready for the quiz on Thursday night. See ya.